At our core as human beings, we are wired for three things that have been hardwired into the hardware of our nervous system through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And that is coherence, connection, and contribution. If you as a leader are not clearly communicating what the purpose of business is and creating processes that allow people space to feel their experiences and make sense of what they are doing, then ultimately you will overwhelm and burn them out. But that's the key. Oh, okay. And so then if you take time to actually understand their identity, their story of who they are and what their core values are, what they actually say matters most to them, now suddenly work can be a place where they get to enact and express at least part of their...
Hello and welcome to the Leadership Launchpad, where we are helping technical managers improve themselves, their teams, and their organizations. On this show, I talk with industry leaders, coaches, authors, and experts to help give you actionable insights that will help improve your own performance and the performance of those around you. Our guest today is Matt Shenker. Matt is a behavioral scientist, licensed therapist, and the creator of the Empowered Wellbeing and Empowered Leadership Models. He is the COO and co-founder of Mattermore, a company working on bringing work back to life with behavior science and AI. In today's episode, you can expect to learn what trust debt is, why modern leaders feel so overwhelmed, and the surprising truth that people need work today more than ever. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you to make sure you subscribe to the show so you never miss a future episode. And if you are already subscribed, thank you. And if I could ask you to share this show with just one other person, I can't tell you how much it would mean to me, because that, after all, is how we grow. So with that out of the way, let's get into the discussion with Matt Shenker. Matt, welcome to the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
Matt, hey, I'm good. It's good to see you. Always good to be with another Matt.
Always good to be with another Matt. And then to add a third Matt to it, your company is called Mattermore. Is that correct?
Mattermore, that's right.
I love it. A lot of our discussion today, we already had kind of a meeting before this. A lot of our discussion is going to be around kind of the technology that you're doing and how the technology is applying to leadership. But before we get to that, just so people have a frame of reference, could you give a brief description of kind of Mattermore, what it is, what you're trying to do with it?
Yeah, so at Mattermore, we're working to bring work back to life.
I love
So
it.
the way that we think about it is we are innovators in the learning and development space. We are here to empower people and structures and systems that anchor the way that people live their lives. Other than when people are spending time alone, the number one place that the modern human spends their time is at work. We have a public health crisis. People are the most depressed, lonely, and stressed that the planet has ever seen. A big piece of that is because we're not designing and allocating our resources well. We
Yeah.
are the richest people that the planet has ever seen, but that richness is not evenly distributed.
Yeah.
And so what we see in our workplaces is these rates of burnout that we're seeing across industries is a design problem. It's showcasing the gap in skills that we're missing. And so at Mattermore, we're using the latest technologies. We're experimenting with a few different things that we do with AI, but the core of it is that we work with companies to identify what their learning and development, manager support, manager onboarding needs are. And then we build people operations infrastructure. Our core product is a manager co-pilot that joins calls like many of the note takers do, and then gives them personalized summaries and action items along with feedback. So, I'm a behavior scientist. We have a proprietary process for creating somebody's psychographic profile, what their values are, their leadership style, their skills, the skills that they want to cultivate. And then that roots into the feedback that they get in their one-on-ones and in their interactions with their employees. So we're trying to supercharge and augment management, and we're trying to transform and empower the workplace to be less destructive and
Yeah.
more regenerative and sustainable. And none of that being fluffiness or just
Yeah.
about coming in and talking about being nicer to people, all
Yep.
of it being about empowering people with scientifically rooted tools and data driven resources and technologies to help them get more work done and to empower their well-being along the way.
I love it. I love that, I love especially that last part where you really focused in on this idea that it's not the fluffy stuff, it's the hard stuff. It's giving real practical things. And I think one of the main focuses of how I'd love to start is because, you started, I don't know, maybe saying you started fluffier is incorrect, but but you did start with your career literally started with helping, transform schools, public education,
Yeah.
like transforming schools. You moved into corporate leadership. That for most people would feel pretty far away from anything to do with AI. So how did you make that shift from kind of formal education, corporate leadership development into AI?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I, I I'm not a fluffy guy. You know, you won't find anybody throughout my life that really would have said, "Oh, you know what Matt's probably going to do? He's probably going to become a licensed therapist that's going to talk to people about their emotions." In fact, my very first year out of grad school, when I was working in a school and I had a private practice, I was working with clients. I was sitting in a meeting over the summer talking about something with a bunch of administrators, and one principal was running late and I didn't recognize the name because she had gotten remarried. But she came in late, and it was my high school principal. And she came in late to the meeting, and she sat down at the table. She kind of glanced over at me, and then she looked again, and she said, "Matt Shenker, what the fuck are you doing here?"
Ah!
And so it's funny, the way that I found myself in education was really because I got obsessed with behavior science and philosophy and psychology. And the
Okay.
deeper I went down that rabbit hole, the more I discovered how our systems aren't using the insights that we have cultivated in our society.
Hmm.
So, a lot of people understand we've had a ridiculous rate of innovation when it comes to computer science,
Yep.
right? We've gone from typewriter to computer to internet to AI in about 80 years. We've had that same rate of innovation when it comes to the behavior science. The
Yeah.
question of how we change behavior, how we effectively help people to learn or transform behaviors or perform sustainably at a high level, those aren't unanswered questions that we need to go get a bunch more researchers funding for so that they can answer. We have decades worth of research that answers that question really well. It's not a knowledge gap problem, it's an implementation gap problem. In
Yeah.
fact, when I was in grad school, I went to Finland and I studied the education system over there. And I asked them, I was like, how did you guys transform from being near the bottom of the barrel in the 80s to consistently being in the top three education systems in the world? And they said it was really easy, actually. Um, and what we did was we just listened to and cultivated and read and applied all of the research that was funded by and completed within the United States. And so other people are using our research, are
Interesting.
taking our greatest insights and implementing them into our systems. We're not doing a good job of doing that. And so when I
Interesting.
started to walk into our schools, while I was just like absorbing all this information about behavior science and psychology and studying, and really I was obsessed, I I sort of felt the way that I imagine a surgeon would if we sent him back in time 200 years ago, and he saw the way that people were doing surgery without washing their hands. There are
Hmm.
just basic foundational things that have been well
Yeah.
established within the literature as best practice, things to do and things not to do, and it's just not implemented in
Yep.
modern manager development, modern workplace learning and development, modern education curricula design, or
Mm-hmm.
even training of educators, even training of mental health professionals. It takes a long time for all those things to watershed into the systems, and they haven't been implemented well. And so that's where my passion then got into, okay, I want to see if I can start to implement some of this into the schools. And then while I
Mm-hmm.
was working in the schools, I discovered none of the teachers really cared what the young hotshot therapist guy thought the science said about what they should do differently. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
it's
Yep.
kind of that
Yep.
thing like no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yep.
And there's also a piece of like, you're one of the youngest people in the building. You're going to come in here, and
Yep.
I've been doing this for 20 years, or 40 years, or 60
Yep.
years, and you're going to tell me what to do differently.
Yep.
what makes you think you know what's really going on here? Just because you've read a bunch of research papers and maybe worked with kids or with schools a few places. And
Totally.
so that's really where then I started to dive deep in the organizational psychology literature and really constructed an entire framework for transforming organizational culture. Because it
Okay.
wasn't about me being able to lecture one time about what the science says is best practice. That doesn't work. It's why when
Yeah.
people go to a Tony Robbins style event and they're really jazzed up and excited and they have the most amazing week of their lives, when you check in with them 3 months later, most of them, their life isn't any different,
Yep.
because that's not how we learn. We learn in systemized ways through repetition. And so I actually had to figure out, how do I transform this organizational culture where these teachers they're actually coming to me asking me questions about what they could do, where they're actually asking each other for help, where they're actually interested in learning, where there's a bit more trust and excitement here, as opposed to a lot of just complaining, blaming, shaming, and closed offedness.
Yep.
And that really is then what led me into this place where I then started working with lots of different schools. And my best friends who I was living with were sales managers. And then they started asking me questions about how they run their teams.
Oh,
And then I started
okay.
working with other teams, and it
So
kind of
that's
all
the
spiraled into a business.
yeah, so that's kind of the transition from the schools into the corporate world. I love
Exactly.
I got to find that clip from earlier where you kind of pause for a second where you're just like the teachers don't really care. And then you paused. We got to like just but I loved how it was about they didn't care about what you were thinking, but which is great because I think the fact that you were in a hostile-ish environment forced you to bring more rigor to bear and really come up with,
Yeah.
a real framework. And then that's, I'm imagining, what allowed you to have the success as you transition into the corporate world as well.
Yeah. And honestly, with schools, um, the problem was really that the teachers cared a lot. And what
Yeah,
they cared a
of
lot
course.
about was all of the things that they felt everyone else wasn't paying enough attention to. Because
Hmm.
that's what happens when you have an education system where, a principal and an assistant principal are responsible for managing all of the teachers in the building. And they
Mm-hmm.
maybe get 2 feedback sessions in a year.
Mm-hmm.
And those teachers don't have a lot of other support, and they're not getting consistent feedback. And
Mm-hmm.
they're consistently having more things added to their list of responsibilities. And so
Mm-hmm.
becomes this pile up of stuff where it's like, before you talk to me about what we should be doing differently, I'm actually walking in immediately with a defensiveness,
Yeah.
because there's a whole bunch of stuff that you have piled up. There's a bunch of what I call trust debt here that we
Mm, I
need
like
to
that.
address. And I need to know that you've acknowledged and that you see what I've been holding. And until you do that, I'm going to be defensive, and my defensiveness is that I'm trying to redirect the conversation to this stuff that you have forced me
Mm.
to hold back. And so I had to understand that piece and figure out, how do I show up in a place that acknowledges that? And then there was a place of actually showing up and calling forward a conversation. And this isn't, I've found this to be true, obviously, not just in schools, this is any organization.
Mm-hmm.
Most workers in modern day organizations are walking around and have some of that trust debt that they're carrying. And that's
Absolutely.
that's what comes up with change management, right? When changes are coming up, people are scared of change, they're frustrated about new things, but also any resentments that somebody's carrying about other processes of the old ways, they're also carrying, and they want to be acknowledged. And so with any change, you have to acknowledge some of that stuff. You have to find some space for that to get acknowledged. And then you have to do this other piece. When I was working with schools, the line I would use was, I would say, look, if we are talking about disarming explosives, or we're talking about designing rocket ships that we send to space, it is not okay to avoid having conversations about what the science says best practice is.
Yep.
So, why is it okay when we're talking about the way that we design these systems that nurture and teach our children,
Yep.
our most valuable resource in society?
Yep.
And ultimately, that's what the workplace too. We can't avoid these conversations about what the science says about effective learning, skill development, workplace collaboration, and management.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so that makes sense. That I love that point of just that whole arc of we don't know it all, but we know a lot, and there's a
Yeah.
lot that we're not doing. A friend of mine commonly says, specifically talking about leaders. Really, we don't need whole new transformations. We don't need any new theories. What we need is consistent execution of the basics. Like that's what
Yeah.
she always talks about. So that makes sense. So that's the school route. Moving into the business world, where did AI come into this?
Yeah, well, really, it was, there was a very clear problem, and AI just happened to be the best technology for empowering the solution. And
Okay.
so the problem is it has several layers, right? One, manager development is wildly outdated. We just haven't innovated the space with what the modern behavior science has showed us through the last few decades
Yep.
widely enough throughout the market. And so most managers, when I talk to them, and I've talked to thousands, I say like, "What kind of training did you get for your first role?" Most of them, it's something like somebody sent me an email with like a Google Drive folder
Yeah.
and said like, read this stuff, and then they
Yeah.
introed me through email with a bunch of people I was supposed to go meet and hop on calls with, and
Yeah.
then maybe throughout the next couple of weeks they checked in on me and said, "Hey, how are things going?"
Yeah.
And some version of that, basically.
Yeah.
And so, not shocking that managers kind of feel like they are lacking feedback and
Yes.
are really unsure of themselves on average for
Yes.
the first 4 to 5 years of their first role. And most
Yeah.
managers I talk to, when I say, how long did it take you before you felt like you were really effective in your first role? Most of them say 9 to 18 months.
Oh, for
And when
sure.
I say, how did you figure it out? I found some of them, about a third in the data from my interviews, about a third had a mentor that they found. Not that they were
Mm.
necessarily provided, but they had a
Yeah.
mentor. About
Yeah.
half of that third were provided a mentor, but the other
Mm.
half went and they found them somewhere somehow. The
Kind of
others, it was
lucky.
basically a smorgasbord of like, I like watched YouTube videos, I found these courses. Some of them maybe got reimbursed or partially funded by their
Yep.
company, and then
Yep.
occasionally some companies had some, you know, courses internally, some trainings internally. Very few people, only about 8% of the thousands that we interviewed,
Wow.
actually said that they felt like the in-house trainings and resources were supremely helpful and useful and made good use of their time. And
Mm.
so we have a massive fracture within our manager development system across our industries. And so that's one problem. The other problem is the expectations of leadership have continued to explode through the last few decades. Because again, work is the place we're spending so much of our time, and the world has changed so drastically through the last few decades. With social media, the smartphone, and the internet, things have been drastically changing with how we live our lives. And workers continually, year over year, according to Gallup's polls through the last 4 years, the stress rates have gone higher and higher and higher. So, who's
Mm-hmm.
the person that ends up being responsible for that? Our workplace leaders, because they're the ones responsible for making those people productive somehow.
Yep.
And then, of course, you've got through the last couple decades a big initiative around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And like these trainings that kind of show up and people say, all right, now you're expected to do some of this stuff differently. And then managers are sitting there saying, well, wait a second. Um, this is not what I was promoted being told I was going to do. And now what kind of trainings am I getting? Oh, you want me to watch some videos and like do some surveys, and then I'm going to sort of feel like I'm now walking on eggshells because I'm worried
Yeah.
about making mistakes.
Yeah.
And so there are these new initiatives that are popping up left and right without actual substantive systematic change to how onboarding and ongoing development for managers and leaders goes.
Yeah.
You have just the leadership development and onboarding system being broken as a whole, the expectations continuing to rise. And we're seeing through the last 2 decades, spending on leadership development has continued to skyrocket,
Mm-hmm.
whereas satisfaction with leadership outcomes has continued to go
Yeah.
down. So we're
Yeah.
willing to spend on it. We're not doing the right stuff. So then, about 9 years ago, when I started working with corporations, I got really curious. So I started, asking a bunch of CEOs, chief people officers, CROs, CTOs, C-suites. And I said, when you have professional development dollars to spend and you want to bring in a trainer, how do you decide what to spend money on? And they would say, well, I basically do this stuff because I like it. Or, I get a good feeling
Ah.
about somebody and I bring them in. Or sometimes it'd be like, I kind of use our engagement survey data, but not really, because only about 40% of the people really fill it out, and it's kind of biased. And
Yep.
well, sometimes it's just rooted in like what our goals are that year or those next
Yep.
few years, or it's
Yep.
influenced by like just what our shareholders think that we should be doing more of. And so sometimes it's just about appearances. And so all of those problems sort of turn into this question of like, how do we solve this? So I was
Yeah.
doing it with services, right? I was working as a consultant and a trainer and a coach, and I had a few other providers I had a rev share model with where I would bring them in, and we had this culture diagnostic process, and I would help people identify their skills, and we would do leadership retreats and offsites. But ultimately, it was sort of exhausting because it was just a massive consultancy, and over again, I'd work with organizations, and there was so much that was happening that was the same or very similar.
Yep.
So I started to see there was a real product that could be had here. One of the core challenges is just it's hard to identify places to focus intervention and systemize improvement or structure change because there's such little data around the interactions of how people are interacting.
Yeah.
And so, if
It's all
you were to
anecdotes.
it's all anecdotes, it's all qualitative perspective data.
Yes.
And so that's super muddy. So if you were to take like a gallon of water and you were to pour a bunch of sediment into it
Okay.
that had all kinds of stuff in it, assume it's not radioactive, but there's all
Okay.
kinds of stuff in it. And then I
Yeah.
were to hand it to you and I shook it up and I stirred it up so you could be sure every sip would have a little bit in there. You probably wouldn't want to drink it.
Yep.
But I'll just ask you this question live. Like, scale 0 to 100, what is your confidence that there is somebody somewhere that has the technology to filter that water and make it drinkable again?
Oh, 100.
100. Great. And
Yep.
then how would you know that it was drinkable? Assume you're a billionaire even. So you could have any resources you
Mm.
need to. Like how would you know
I mean,
that it was
I'm sure
drinkable?
I'm sure you could test it in some way.
You'd test it and then you would test it for, whatever sort of
Yeah.
metrics you would be
Yeah.
looking for, right?
Yeah.
The presence or absence of certain substances that would be
Yeah.
toxic to your body.
Yeah.
We can do that now with organizational culture
That
because
is the key.
culture is about behaviors that happen.
Yep.
Culture comes from the Latin word cultus, which means what you care about. And so it's represented and drawn and shaped by the behaviors that you execute, reinforce, or disallow consistently.
Yep.
And so we have more data about the behaviors of what people are doing within organizations than ever because of the explosion of remote work, especially in a post COVID world. So
Yep.
we have all this data that's just going massively underutilized, where now we have the opportunity to make the waters of what our organizations look like, how people are interacting, the quality of our culture, to make it more measurable so that
Yep.
then we can make it improvable. And
Yep.
so the deeper I basically stumbled upon a few people about 5 years ago in Silicon Valley as I was just doing a bunch of coaching and consulting. And I had met my co founder who had scaled and sold a mobile app development agency. And we were sort of just exploring what it feels like there's a product here. And we're just talking to a lot of different folks and doing some user research along the way. And we met some folks that were working with LLMs. They basically said, look, I don't think it's there yet, but this technology is changing everything.
Yep.
And it is exactly what I think it sounds like you want to work with so that you
Yeah.
can work with linguistic data to tell more of the story of what's happening between relationships so that you can empower managers with more insight and feedback on what they're doing just personally for them, so you can empower business leaders with a little bit more visibility, not from a big brother standpoint, but from the same sort of standpoint that you would with just being able to see how much revenue you're bringing in, how many new users you have,
Yeah.
any other data that's relevant to you, how much energy you're utilizing, inputs and outputs. You have to be able to strategically manage that, and you can't manage what you can't measure.
Yeah. You're reminding me of there's a presentation I give from time to time what that's just titled First Principles Leadership Development. And we talk
Mm.
about the difference between reasoning by analogy and reasoning by first principles, and kind of what you were saying you were seeing again and again. And so often when you ask people like, how are you making these decisions, it's reasoning by analogy, where we're just saying like, oh well, this is what we did before, oh these are the kinds of things that I like, this is, this is similar to the organization that I used to be in. We're looking for things that are like we had before, Whereas
Right.
now we can reason by first principles, which is, in I do the whole thing with like a rocket analogy where we're going back to physics and like material sciences of like what is the steel capable of,
Mm,
how much energy do you get when you combust liquid oxygen and liquid methane. It's like very grounded. And the same thing is now starting to be possible in these other places because we're able to really quantify what is happening. Without AI, we can get
yes.
back to, even without AI, we can get back to still grounding it in psychology, in behaviors, but AI gives us this whole new lens to really drill down of, um, to make that all the more specific. Because even without it,
Yes.
even if we're saying we think we have these behavioral problems, that's still partially like anecdote or at best anecdata, where yeah,
It's muddy. It's not clear
yeah,
data. You're
exactly.
telling assuming you have seen everything that's going
Yeah,
on in the
yeah,
business, that you have
yeah,
seen 100% of it, which is the first problem. But
yeah,
assume that you have. You're still filtering that by all of your biases
yeah,
and your knowledge. So you're
yeah,
limited by your ability to diagnose what you're seeing happen.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
And the way,
So,
the way I describe it is like if I were in an operating room
mhm,
and I were suddenly asked to do surgery, whoever's on that surgery table is shit out of luck. And you know what wouldn't really help me at all?
hmm,
You could go ahead and have me step out of the surgery room every
yep,
once in a while, have me step
yep.
out of the OR and hop on a Zoom call with the world's greatest surgical teacher, and I can tell him everything I saw, and then he's going to tell me all kinds of stuff, and then I'm going to step back in there, and guess what? Probably not going to be super helpful. But you know where
Still
it
not
might
gonna work
stand a
out.
chance is if that guy or that lady can see exactly what I'm doing in real time, and
Yeah,
they can coach me up on exactly what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. They can give me real time insight, and now learning is happening within the flow of my work.
yeah,
And so that's what we have the opportunity to move the modern workplace to move modern performance management, to move modern learning and development into, is actually like eroding this difference between
yeah,
training and work. It's not
yeah,
that, oh cool, my company has some courses on their dashboard I can go to in my free time, which like ask workers, where do you feel like your free time is in your calendar? There's a
yeah,
reason no one's
yeah,
using those courses because it ultimately is going to be a nice to have. You erode
exactly.
that and instead figure out how can we weave skill development into the flow of work where it actually becomes part of what we're doing here that's actually
Yep,
hyper relevant to you. And we can do that, so we should.
yep. So now that you're getting plugged in, so one, you were saying that, even as a consulting service, you were seeing the same things again and again. Now you're much more connected, looking at things much more granularly. When it
Yeah.
comes to leaders, like what are some of the most common struggles you're seeing, kind of especially with new leaders?
Yeah, well the first one that is just everywhere is dealing with overwhelm,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So
Why is that? Like
overwhelm.
what's making it so, why is there so
I,
much
I can
overwhelm in leaders?
I can tell it to you really simply actually.
Yeah.
Um, the rate of change with our technology has been rapidly speeding up to the point where socioculturally we are not able to keep up. The way that people lived their lives 200 years ago is more similar to the way people lived 800 years ago than it is today. The average
Yes.
life expectancy 200 years ago was still 35 to 40. If you factor in infant mortality rates, then it still just raises it to people in their 50s and 60s. And
Yep.
so, you know what they didn't have? A massive group of people who were in their 70s, 80s, 90s who were controlling all of the votes around what kind of tax
Yeah.
legislation gets passed
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what kind of programs get funded. And
Yeah.
so no one's ever had to deal with that. You know what else they didn't have to deal with? The internet,
Yep.
phones. Their news happened in very structured places.
Yep.
Usually it was word of mouth, and then eventually it was written down. Only in the last 100 years has it gotten to this place where first it was the radio, and then it was television, and it got to close to immediate. We've only had the 24-hour news cycle since the 90s with O.J. Simpson. And so what you started to see was as technology rapidly innovated, there was a shift that happened. For most of human history, the ratio between seconds of available attention that I have to spend, and content that I could pay attention to. Content meaning collection of information that exists outside of the heads, hands, or mouths of a person. Content was massively favorable to the seconds of available attention we had. You could go into most people's homes, and guess what? You would run out of stuff to look at. And you'd have to say, okay, we're going to have to, I'm going to have to go talk to some people, or I'm going to have to go do some stuff, assuming that just could just be leisurely about. Even the richest people, the printing press was invented to the 1400s. Most people weren't really literate and able to read, let alone having access to books. That's still fairly recent. And so in the 70s and 80s, as televisions became cheaper and more widespread, and the majority of Americans then had one, and television channels went from three to hundreds, and the internet made it so now anything that was published anytime was available all the time, everywhere, the scales shifted.
Okay.
And so, overwhelm, the definition is the feeling within your nervous system as though the world is unfolding too fast for you to catch up.
Hmm.
And so that is literally what people's experience is just of the modern day life,
Hmm.
because our boundaries and structure for how we relate with content, information, and each other are totally eroded. So we had the 24-hour news cycle that surged in the 90s. We started
Mm-hmm.
paying a lot of attention to the TV. Then 9/11 happened in 2001, and then
Mm-hmm.
people's anxiety rates skyrocketed, and they never came down.
Mm-hmm.
At that same time, because of the proliferation of the internet and communication technologies, people were collaborating and talking at a rate and exchanging ideas globally more than ever before, right? So of course the economy then started to massively shift, which then a bunch of sudden changes to a lot of communities. People now could be even more mobile than they had been, which is still a really new thing. Up until World War II, the majority of Americans lived in rural areas. It wasn't until after World War II when people came home, and now there was a booming workforce with a booming economy that got rich because of the war and manufacturing weapons. Now you could have all kinds of jobs in a city center. You could have suburban areas that you could fund. People could go to college because it was funded by the government because they served in the military. And so
Mm-hmm.
this boom created these cities. That's a really recent thing. And
Mm-hmm.
now you have this residential mobility. For the vast majority of human existence, for the vast majority of just human civilization, which you could say goes back 10,000 or 14,000 years, we lived close to our most trusted and most closely related human beings. We
Yep.
knew intimately the names of our neighbors. We we connected with them in intentional ways on a daily and weekly basis. And so the residential mobility, the proliferation of communication technologies, and our inability to keep up socioculturally to figure out how do we legislate regulations and boundaries with those technologies? How do we live lifestyles where we can utilize the best of those technologies without the worst of them, creating bad habits for ourselves? All of that has turned into this place where now children are being raised with less emotionally available adults around them at a time when they are surrounded by more information and more stimuli that they could be paying attention to. And trust in institutions has plummeted since the Nixon years, because since that proliferation of communication technology, we're able to just see more. So we see the ways that the financial institutions or our politicians have lied to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's harder for us to trust the institutions. And
Mm-hmm.
that trust is what expands our platform, our ability to regulate stress. So our trust is shrinking, our availability of having other emotionally available adults to help us co-regulate our nervous systems, that availability is shrinking, while there are more demands on our attention than ever. And so from both directions, our capacity is minimizing while the demands on us are increasing. So of
Yeah.
course we're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Of course we're overwhelmed. So
And
one is you need to have skills for managing your own overwhelm. But
okay.
then two, you need to be able to have skills for managing other people's overwhelm and creating supportive structures that empower them to be productive and empower them to create trust together so that they're not as overwhelmed. So that's the number one thing that I see people struggling with across the
Okay.
board is how do I manage my own overwhelm as a leader with all these challenges happening right now, all these changes happening, call it AI, advances in biotechnology, accessibility of wearables, these sort of super cycles that are happening. What do I do about all these changes? How do I lead my team in a way where like
Yeah.
they can have hope that, the quarterly planning that we're doing isn't going to be totally outdated and a total waste of their time
Yeah.
because we don't know what technology OpenAI is going to release next month. Like, how do we just lead people through a time that is inherently overwhelming? That's the number one thing across the board.
That makes sense. And then kind of to that point of, it was interesting. So a couple days ago, I got the opportunity to watch a keynote from Dan Pink, the author of
Cool.
Drive and several other books. It was a fantastic
Yeah.
keynote.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things he was saying is he said that way to the number one determining factor in like satisfaction at work and driving engagement at work was making meaningful progress on work that matters.
Yeah.
That's what people want. They just
Yeah.
and I think because so much of what you just said is absolutely true, but also as a manager I'm like, well, I don't know, it's not like I can control the election or I can't stop AI or I can't do any of
Right.
this stuff. But there
Right.
is if you simplify it down and say, okay, that's all table stakes, that's all out there and happening, but still, who has the most control over whether or not the people on your team on a day-to-day basis can answer the question, can say, I have made meaningful progress on work that matters.
Yes.
So much
Yes.
of that
So
can come back to the manager of, are you
definitely.
bombarding them with emails? Are you bombarding them with Slack messages and random meetings? And are you making it clear what they should be working on? So, there's 1,000 questions surrounding that, but it all comes back to making meaningful progress on work that matters. That is something that a
Well, and
manager
and, and I
can
and I
affect.
would add a piece to that, right? Because
Yeah.
making meaningful progress on work that matters. So then the word there that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting is matters,
Yes. Yes, it is. Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
okay. So what matters? Well, who are we talking about?
Yeah.
We're talking about human beings.
Yeah.
And so the big unlock here for leaders and managers, the big thing I underlined is not that like we're all screwed because things are just overwhelming and
I
like
hope
it
not.
sucks. Right? That's not the
Yeah.
story here.
Yes.
The story here is we have such an amazing opportunity because people need their workplaces more than ever.
Yep.
And there are more resources than there ever have been that are accessible about how to be an effective leader and structure work in empowering ways. And so, what that means is if you're a good leader and you're able to create what I call an empowering organizational culture, your
Yeah.
people will run through walls for you.
Yeah.
Your people will retain, they will work their hardest
Yeah.
because what we've seen is rates of loneliness and purposelessness have been skyrocketing.
Yeah.
In 1980, they did this study where they asked people in the last 6 months, how many people have you talked to about close personal matters? And the average answer was three. By 2006, when they did the follow up for that study, 6 years before the majority of teens had an iPhone, the average answer was zero.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm sure you know the longest longitudinal study on happiness done by Harvard.
Yes.
So that study they've studied for 4 generations. They started
Yes.
off asking the question, "What's the greatest predictor of health span
Mm-hmm.
and
This is crazy.
happiness?"
This is crazy.
Right? The greatest predictor is what's it going to be? Is it how much money you make? Is
Do
it
you
your zip
smoke?
code? Is it how much you smoke? How much you drink? What foods you eat? How often you
Yeah.
exercise? And it wasn't any of that, but it was one metric, and it was the quality of relationships that you have access to.
Yeah.
And that's important because even if you just had one high quality relationship, that was a greater predictor of your happiness and your
Yep.
health span than anything else.
Yeah.
And so there's a reason for that. And it connects to the work of like Daniel Pink and anyone else that dives into motivation. At our core, as human beings, we are wired for three things that have been hardwired into the hardware of our nervous system through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution.
Yeah.
And that is coherence, connection, and contribution.
Mm.
Coherence. We are story making creatures. We
Mm-hmm.
want to figure out what are we experiencing around us? How does
Mm-hmm.
that connect to the stuff that I experienced before? If you as a leader are not clearly communicating what the purpose of business is and creating processes that allow
Mm-hmm.
people space to feel their experiences and make sense of what they are doing, then ultimately you will overwhelm and burn them out. But that's
Yep.
the key. Oh, okay. And so then if you understand, if you take time to actually understand their identity, their story of who they are and what their core values are, what they actually say matters most to them, now suddenly work can be a place where they get to enact and express at least part of their story. It doesn't get to be a place for their full expression. They don't get to come in and,
Sure.
they shirtless because they believe in being a nudist. But
Ha.
ultimately, if they deeply believe that they are meant to be an a creative, that they deeply care about being creative, and they're an engineer. There are ways you can design what they work on that actually acknowledge that. And you can say, hey, so we've got this next project coming up, and I'm really curious because I know how much you care about really getting to be part of some of those creative decisions. And this is something where I need somebody with those skill sets. And so by understanding somebody's values, now, instead of work being a place where you do stuff for me so that I can bribe you and you can avoid my criticism, instead you show up to work so you can get my support to become more of who you are. So
Yep.
that's important because that coherence is an intrinsic motivator. I don't have to
Yeah.
bribe you to try to make sense of your experience. You're going to do that
Yeah.
anyway. So, how
Yeah.
can I harness that by building processes that allow for that? The other
Yeah.
is connection.
Yeah.
We are hardwired for connection. There was this study done when troops started coming back from Vietnam addicted to heroin. That's when a
Is
lot of studies around drug addiction
Yep. Yep.
boomed. And they found like, well, if you take rats and you put them in a cage and there's water that's just regular water, or there's a water bottle that has heroin in it, guess what? They're going to go to the heroin over and over again, and they are going to die of an overdose. And so that's sort of where our story, our mythology, and our culture about addiction came from. What they don't tell you is that there's this guy, Bruce Perry, that did follow up research. Um, it's called the Rat Park Study. You can Google it, you can look it up.
Hmm.
What he found was actually, if you take rats and you put them in a cage that has other rats and has some activities for them to do,
Hmm.
basically, if you give them some meaningful work with other rats so they get connection and they are able to make a contribution to a shared space, what happened is almost all of them tried the heroin laced water. None of them overdosed and died
Hmm.
because addiction is a behavior that we enact in order to cope with needs not being met.
Mm.
And one of our
Interesting.
deepest needs intrinsically is
Is
connection.
connection. Yeah.
And so we're going to look for that. And if you're really honest and you just go and you just look around at what is going on in a workplace, it it's almost hilarious how many things we as people do throughout our day that aren't strategically necessary in order to accomplish tasks.
Yep.
But the real purpose of why we do them is to get validation from someone else so that we
Yep.
can feel safe in our body.
Yep. Yeah.
At, just going to somebody, like stopping by, like, oh, hey, how was your weekend? Like, are you doing that strategically so that you can acknowledge with that person that they've seen you and that you can continue to have a good functional working relationship?
Maybe some people.
No. Yeah, maybe some people.
But
Does somebody
generally
show
no.
up to work with a yellow Lamborghini because it's like they needed the fastest car on the market? No,
That's
they
a good
probably
call.
wanted a little bit of attention and validation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, we evolved as hunter-gatherer nomads and tribes of people. One person doesn't stand a chance against a lion, tiger, or bear, but 10 might and 100 certainly do.
Yep.
That's how we're wired.
Yep.
We're wired to process stress as a system. I call it a relational regulation matrix. We all carry one around in our minds. It's a
Mm-hmm.
process called sociostasis. And so if you don't create systems and you don't cultivate skills for building trust with the people that you work with, again, that doesn't mean being nice to them.
Yep.
It doesn't mean meeting all of their needs for them. It
Yep.
means building trust, following the braving model, meaning setting boundaries. You're gonna when you can't commit to something, you communicate that. You're clear
Yep.
about what is and what is not acceptable here at this workplace.
Yep.
Being reliable. When you say you're going to do something, you do it. You don't overcommit and underdeliver.
Yep.
Being accountable. When you make a mistake, you apologize and you circle back about it. Being a vault, meaning if somebody tells you something that was personal information, you don't go around sharing it.
Yep.
Integrity, meaning someone can believe you're being your real self. Non-judgment. I feel like I could tell you something without you totally judging who I am.
Yep.
And generosity, meaning I believe you're going to make the most generous assumptions about who I am and what my intentions are. Those are the key behaviors that the social science have established builds trust. So as a manager, you build skills for doing those things, you do them intentionally, and now you're supporting your people.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then that allows you to build this sort of process where people can feel like they're making contribution, where you can be supporting them. So I call it being an empowered leader. It's being clear about purpose, building structured processes, and building the support skills for your people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much in there, and I want to close by really calling out something that you said kind of at the beginning of that. That this is reminded me of an episode I did recently with a coach named Justin Hills, because we kind of
Mm,
wound up in the same place. Of you said people need work more than ever, and I
yeah,
think that's a super hot take because we're in a world where everybody's just like, forget work. Like, no, we're not going to work anymore. No, it's all about quiet quitting. It's all about getting out of here. It's all about doing, minimum work possible so that we can get out of here. And that's all
yeah,
happening. But underneath that, because of everything that you outlined, because of how stressful the world is, because of how uncertain the world is, because of how much stuff is out there, if you are able to be a good leader, you can create this place of like serenity and certainty and connection and productivity and getting it all done. And you can, by I think better than the only tweak I would make to people need work more than ever that I would make is people need good managers more than ever. They need and not even leaders, because leaders is almost too high. Like, when you think about the people who are setting these massive visions for the future, it's just like,
yeah,
no, they just need somebody who can create a place where they feel safe, where they can get stuff done, where they can have connection. And
yes,
like you said, there's basic skills that can come down to that. And so I think that's the charge, is that yes, there's lots going on,
100%.
but if you're a manager, if you're a new manager, anywhere in an organization, top to bottom, your people need you
You,
more than
you,
ever.
you, if you're a manager, you've been given a gift.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
is a greater opportunity and a greater potential for you to make a contribution
yeah,
than ever before in a
yep.
role as a manager.
I think that's I think that's a fantastic way to end, Matt. This was a great conversation. Took us on a whole long arc through a ton of stuff, which was amazing. I think that there's some great stuff in there. There's so many good tidbits that I'm looking forward to pulling out of this afterwards as shorts, or I see a bunch of blog posts in the future. So thank you
Awesome.
so much. I'm going to be sure to include the details of how people can reach out to you in the show notes below. Um,
Cool.
so thank you so much. This has been great.
Of course, thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.